Okay. All right, so we can go ahead and begin. Okay, is this everybody?
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Damon Fordham, and I'm an adjunct professor of history. How's it sound? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. I'm an adjunct professor of history at the Citadel, and I also do this tour called The Lost Stories of Black Charleston, where one of the things that I do, is we're going to get into momentarily, is that, excuse me?
Maybe you can just talk a little bit closer to the mic.
Okay, just a moment here.
It's on.
I see.
Yeah. Make those little things make a difference.
Little things mean a lot, huh?
Yes.
All right, just a moment here.
There you go.
It's on right now. Yeah. All right. So, having said all of that, my name is Damon Fordham, and I'm an adjunct professor of history at the Citadel, and I also do this tour called The Lost Stories of Black Charleston, in which my trusty assistant here, Miss Abby Stahl, is one of the good ladies that takes good care of you while you go there before we give you the tours. And she's going to be selling my books here after I'm finished speaking. Now, a little bit about myself. I was born in Spartanburg. I was put up for adoption in infancy, and I was raised in Mount Pleasant, went to Wando High School, and then went to the University of South Carolina for my undergraduate and to the College of Charleston for my graduate degree. Now here's a little bit of things that went along the way. I became an author. And how did I become an author? How did I become a historian? How did I get into what I get to do? Well, the books tell part of the story, and here goes. You see, I was considered rather strange as a child. I was very unathletic, and you know, most people expect little boys to be very athletic, good at all things physical and nothing mental. I was the opposite when I was a kid. I was considered quite strange as a child. I was quite the bookworm. And as you'll see on the cover of this book, this is me when I was 8 years old. And fortunately, I had one thing that was my saving grace from being bullied and ostracized and all these other things was that I had a really good dad who kind of understood me more than a lot of other people did, and who encouraged me in a lot of things. And the best thing of all was that he loved to tell stories. You see, he grew up during the days not only of segregation, but during the Great Depression, as well as World War II. And he loved to talk, and I loved to listen. And the best thing about my dad when he loved to talk was that he was very animated. For example, how many of you out here in this audience grew up in Charleston? Very good. So I take it you remember going to shows at the Charleston County Hall at some point, right?
Absolutely.
Very good. Some of you were probably there when Elvis sang there, right? Oh, which time? 1956. But anyway.
No, I'm saying I wish.
Oh, you wish. Okay. All right. Very good.
And I went to wrestling matches.
Ah, you went to wrestling matches. Well, Dad used to love to tell the story of how he used to sing with the gospel group. And he used to tell me how at one time during the show the guitarist playing while he was singing, right? And the guitarist was so loud, the guitarist was going, chang-a-lang-a-lang-a-lang-dang, chang-a-lang-a-lang-a-lang-dang, so much that the guitarist, when he was singing, he was going, moving his mouth, and no one could hear what he was saying because he was going so loud with the chang-a-lang-a-lang-a-lang-dang, the chang-a-lang-a-lang-a-lang-dang. So naturally, as a kid, this was about as much fun for me as Bruce Lee or Batman or anything like that for kids at my age. So, he would also tell me stories about his experiences in World War II and segregation and things of that sort, and I would just sit there riveted, fascinated with this stuff. And when he died in 1984, okay, when I was at my first year at the University of South Carolina, okay, so 7 years later, 7 years to the day he passed, February 14th, 1991, I was standing by his grave, and I thought, wouldn't it be tragic if these stories were to die with them? So I went home and I wrote down as many of his tales that I can remember, and I said, you know what, this would make a good book, but how could I possibly make this interesting enough for other people to want to read? And I came up with this story about this shy, bullied ostracized little kid who everybody thought was strange, yours truly. And I came up with this story that involved this other old gentleman in my youth. A gentleman by the name of Walter Snipe, who you see here, the second guy in this picture. Walter Snipe died when I was 8 years old, 1973. And he partially raised my mother after her grandparents died. And he was quite a character. I remember one time I was in his car and I knocked over his ashtray. And he goes, "Damon, I'm going to get you when we get home. I'm going to tell your mama. And she's going to beat you behind." And I was laughing through this because I knew he didn't have the heart to hit me. But again, I found him this interesting gentleman because even though he was very gruff, I could tell that he loved me in his own way. So I fused the characters of Mr. Snipe and my dad together to create this character called Mr. Potts. This man who, while he had his flaws, was a man who was earnest, hardworking, and full of love and filled with these stories. And I came up with a story about how he befriended this lonely little kid and would tell him all these fascinating stories that got him through life. And some 20 years later, that became this book, Mr. Potts and Me. So far, it's been my only exercise in fiction. But aside from that, over the years, I developed this habit of going through old newspapers and I worked at the old Charleston County Library that used to be on King Street before they tore that down and built a new one. And one of the things that I did was I loved to go through microfilms. And when I went through microfilms, I found stories that were not in the history books. Because every time you read a newspaper, you'll notice that the vast majority of the stories that you read in the newspaper or that you watch on television at night, they're forgotten the next day. And sometimes they left a lot of gems behind that were forgotten. So I started collecting a lot of those over the years. And pretty soon, I took the storytelling gifts of my dad and my love for finding these things, first as a newspaper columnist, then as a radio journalist, and then as a history teacher, and eventually an adjunct history professor, as well as docenting at various places up to the tours I do now. So essentially what I did was I took my love for research and my love for storytelling and combined them in a way that would make things interesting and to help bring out understanding. So, about 15 years ago, I collected my first volume of these into this book called True Stories of Black South Carolina. And I'm about to share a couple of them with you. One is that I learned through my research that Martin Luther King once spoke here back in Charleston. He spoke twice. Once in 1962 at Mother Emanuel AME, and again at the Charleston County Hall on July 30th, 1967. Now, how many of you have heard of a man in Charleston named Mr. Herbert Fielding?
Oh, yeah.
Very good. He used to be a mortician as well as a state senator. Well, it turns out that Mr. Fielding was on stage with Martin Luther King that day. And he told me this story in 1999 that I put in the book that went like this. He said that when Dr. King came here, he was the recipient of a ton of death threats. The Ku Klux Klan met in nearby Ravenel, South Carolina, and threatened to kill him when he came to town. So Mayor J. Palmer Gilliard, some of y'all remember him, put Charleston under martial law the day that Dr. King came. And he went to the old county hall on King Street. And there were National Guardsmen and policemen all over the place, but yet a racially mixed crowd of 2,900 came to see him that day. So as he walked on stage, everybody was kind of nervous. And people were worried that he might get shot right there in Charleston. But as he went up to the microphone, he showed no fear. And as he began to speak, Mr. Fielding said that there was a lunatic in the balcony who had a light bulb, a huge light bulb in his hands. And the crazy man took the light bulb and threw it on the stage, and it went pow, like a rifle shot. And everybody on the stage was looking around, wondering, oh my goodness, what happened to Dr. King? While a local photographer named George Lee, who I used to know very well, who passed some years ago, took a picture of everybody on the stage looking all shocked and worried, except for Dr. King. In the picture, which is in the book, Dr. King is sitting there flat-footed and focused on what he is saying and not aware of the calamity around him. And as all this was going on, the Charleston police ran up in the balcony and grabbed the guy and had him locked up. But according to Mr. Fielding, Dr. King did not flinch as he spoke to the audience. So after it was over with, Mr. Fielding told me that he went over to Dr. King as he was leaving. Martin, are you all right? Why, of course I'm all right, Herbert. Why would you ask me such a question? What, didn't you see the crazy man in the balcony throw the light bulb on stage at you? The who? The crazy man in the balcony. Didn't you see when he threw the light bulb on stage and everybody thought you were getting shot and the police ran up there and grabbed the guy and had him locked up? Crazy man, light bulb, balcony, police. Herbert, I have no idea what you're talking about. Ah, come on, Martin. You mean to tell me you didn't notice all this was going on around you? And this went on for a few minutes. And he said that after a few minutes of this, Dr. King put his hand on his shoulder and said, Herbert, let me tell you something. If I would have let every little thing like that distract me from what I'm trying to do, I would never get the liberation of this nation accomplished. Mr. Fielding told me that story in 1999. I put that in this book in 2007, and Mr. Fielding died at the age of 93 in 2015, so he's no longer here to tell that story, but I put all of that in the book so I can stand here today and tell it to you. That's one such story. Another one in that book deals with the real story of Porgy and Bess. Now, I take it most of you in this audience are familiar with Porgy and Bess and Summertime and all these things. Well, there was a real Porgy and Bess, and the real Porgy was born right here on James Island, believe it or not. His name was Samuel Smalls, and he was born with what his father referred to as little images of feet. In other words, he had polio. And there was nothing that he could do in that back country with polio back in 1889. So his father took him to Charleston, where he built him a goat cart. And Nan the goat would pull him around while he would basically beg for food and carry a tin cup in his hand. And every now and then he would go to this place over on Church Street called Cabbage Row, where he would have, there would be a spigot where there was a trough of water, and he would water Nan the goat, and he would take the money in the tin cup and go drink liquor and shoot dice with the fellas. And he tried to talk with one of the ladies. One of the ladies was Maggie Barnes, who lived uptown on number 4 Romney Street. And on the night of March the 22nd, 1924, he went to Maggie Barnes' place, and he had gotten an altercation because he accused her of stealing his watch. So he pulled out his pistol and started shooting at her. Pow! 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 But since he had polio, he couldn't go right up to her and aim straight, so all she had to do was duck. But he was sent to the Old City Jail on Magazine Street. And the headline in the Charleston News and Courier on March the 24th, 1924 read this: Cripple arrested for firing at woman. Ah, the good old days of sensitivity and political correctness, right? Well, down the street from Cabbage Row was a wealthy white author named Du Bois Hayward, who was reading the paper and eating breakfast with his sister that morning, and he came across that story and said, hey, I know this guy. And he thought about Samuel Smalls being born poor, black, disabled, and illiterate, and begging in the streets to survive in his pathetic attempts to find love. And he wrote the novel Fordham in 1925, which, by the way, is a very good novel. So therefore, in 1933, George Gershwin, the great jazzman, read this in New York, and he said, this is really good stuff. And he came down here to collaborate with Du Bois Hayward. And he went to James Island and Folly Island and points therein, going to black churches, picking up the musical traditions of the people, going over to the marketplace over on South Market Street, where you had the ladies selling strawberries going, "Strawberries, they're so fresh and fine." And the fellows selling the little black fish called porgies, going, "Porgy, porgy, what porgy, top porgy, with a knife and fork, porgy," and that sort of thing. And that became the great Broadway musical Porgy and Bess that appeared on Broadway on October the 10th, 1935. George Gershwin died in 1937. Du Bois Hayward died in 1940. Samuel Smalls went to court before Judge S.C. Brown on June the 3rd, 1924. And the judge felt sorry for him, so he suspended his sentence and sent him back home to his mother, where he died 3 months later, and he is buried right over at the St. James Presbyterian Church, not very far from where we are right now. And Maggie Barnes outlived them all. In 1970, the Charleston News and Courier tried to interview her about being the real Bess, but she refused, because by then she was married to a decent man and involved with her church, and she did not want either entity to know about that part of her past. So she took all of that with her to her grave. And in 2007, I went to hear J.C. DeLeston, the grandnephew of Samuel Smalls, talk about this. And he said something interesting that I closed that story with in the book that went as follows. He said that if a man riding around in a goat cart can inspire something that has brought this much joy to the world, then what about us? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the real story of Porgy and Bess. And those are just two of the stories that appear in this book, True Stories of Black South Carolina, which I will be happy to sign for you at the end of this discussion, along with the Mr. Potts and Me book. So let's move on to the stories that are in Voices of Black South Carolina, which is book number 3. Now, this has a number of interesting things dealing with Charleston. One of them is of the great Mr. Philip Simmons. Mr. Simmons, as some of you may know, was born in rural Daniel Island, back when it was rural, around 1912. And his parents wanted him to do better, because in those backcountry areas in those days, for a long time, there were no schools for black children. Because, as we'll discuss a little bit later, the state wanted a permanent class of cheap labor among the black population. So therefore, they had to go to Charleston so he could be educated. And they sent him to Buste School, which, as you probably know, still exists, over on Calhoun Street in 1921, when he was 9 years old. But, like most black boys of his era, his parents had to pull him out when he was 13 years old in 1925, because the family needed money. And if you look at the yearbooks for black schools in those days, you find relatively few males in the graduating classes for that very reason. However, he had the good fortune to be apprenticed to an elderly ex-slave named Mr. Peter Simmons, of no relation, who was from my way in Mount Pleasant. And Peter was a blacksmith during slavery, and his father, Guy Simmons, was a blacksmith during slavery. So they taught Peter the blacksmithing skill, and they became the go-to guys in Charleston for the rich people who wanted the nice, fancy little gates. Peter died in 1955, and Philip took over the business. And soon Philip became famous through the National Geographic and ETV and PBS documentaries as one of the last great practicing blacksmiths in America. So much so that President Reagan honored him with an award back in 1981 for his contributions to the American arts. And when you went to his house, you would see the picture of him and President Reagan. And you would just wait for him to talk about that while he talked about other things, until finally you would just simply say, excuse me, Mr. Simmons, but when did you meet President Ronald Reagan? That! Oh, well, you see, that was when he gave me this award for my artwork. Anyway, et cetera, and so on and so on and so forth. He was that humble that it just simply wasn't that big a deal for him. And in 1998, I took a group of children to meet Mr. Simmons. And in the course of this, he took the children and showed them how he made his ironwork by hand, and he told the children stories. And a little 12-year-old girl named Alexis Drayton asked him, Mr. Simmons, how long did it take you to be a blacksmith? And he looked at the child and said, I'm still learning, honey. That's what life is all about. So every now and then I run into these young people who tell me that they're woke. And I assume that they mean that they have arrived to this great place of knowledge. And I tell them the story that I just told you, and I tell them, now that is woke. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how he went on to inspire me until he died in June of 2009 at the age of 97. And I understand he was a resident here for a while. Am I correct? Yep, fine gentleman, fine gentleman. So I put all of that in the book too. And then in the book came the story of my favorite period in American history, which leads to, which will kind of bleed over into my fourth book. On the cover of this book is a great man named Robert Smalls. Some of you might know his story, and for those of you who don't, I'll tell you the basics and take it from there. You see, Robert Smalls was born in slavery in Beaufort, South Carolina in 1839. And he eventually made his way to Charleston, where he worked and, as was common in those days, gave his slave owner a good portion of his income in the midst of this, right? But he learned to be a boat pilot. And during the Confederacy hired him to pilot a ship called the Planter. But he kind of knew what time it was, as the saying goes. So he came up with this plan. He gathered his family and a few friends together and said, okay, this is going to be our plan. I'm going to sneak you aboard this ship on May the 13th, 1862. And you're going to lie down while I sneak the boat out of Charleston Harbor and sail it into Union waters so we can be free. But understand this, I've got dynamite in the bottom of the ship. Why? Because if the Confederates catch us and figure out what we're going to do, they're going to put us black in slavery. And I know that the majority of you would rather die than to go back in slavery. So if the Confederates catch us, I'm going to pull down the plunger and blow up the ship. So, is there anyone who is not with me in this endeavor? Two of the guys said, well, Rob, I think I better go to my grandmother right now. Two of y'all, go. But just keep your mouths shut and don't tell anyone. So the night of May the 13th, 1862, he sneaked his family and some other friends aboard the ship, and they sailed out of Charleston Harbor and quietly sailed out into Union waters. And once they got out of the Union waters, they pulled down the Confederate flag and put up the white flag of surrender and surrendered the ship to the Union Army. And then thus the ship became the Planter became the property of the Union. Robert Smalls and his family became freed. And so Abraham Lincoln met with him sometime during this period, during the Civil War. And that was one of the factors that led President Lincoln to have black soldiers and sailors fight with the Union for their own freedom during the Civil War. Now, a lot of people know about the Civil War, but few people today talk in detail about what happened next. And that's one of my favorite stories in American history. You see, after the Civil War, you had Reconstruction. And for a long time, the story of Reconstruction was somewhat perverted. To say that during this period, black people ran the state and didn't know what they were doing and drove the state into bankruptcy and all this kind of stuff. Well, I looked at the records of all of these things. I went to find the minutes of a lot of the governmental procedures during this period. I went through old newspapers of the period. And the actual facts tell a considerably different story. Here's what happened, ladies and gentlemen. During that Reconstruction era, you had 3 constitutional amendments that were passed. The 13th Amendment, 1865, that ended slavery throughout the country. The 14th Amendment, 1868, said all persons born here were citizens. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 that said all men had the right to vote. Women would get that in 1920, the 19th Amendment. And so thus, African Americans were allowed to vote, and miraculous things happened. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 1872, they had the first African American governor. His name was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, and he was the founder of Southern University, the largest black college in America. During that same period, here in South Carolina, you had this gentleman over here by the name of Alonzo Jacob Rancière. He was a black man of Haitian ancestry, and he was lieutenant governor from 1870 to 1872. He was followed by another black man as a lieutenant governor. His name was Richard Howard Leeds from 1872 to 1877, and guess what? He served governor under Franklin J. Moses. And guess what that meant for South Carolina? That was the first time in American history that you had a Jewish governor and a black lieutenant governor of the state at the same time. That's South Carolina, not New York. That wouldn't happen again until New York in the 2000s. Something to think about, right? But most importantly of all out of all this is that in January of 1868, from January to April of that year, they had a convention at what is now the J. Waties Waring Judicial Center over on Meeting Street. And guess what happened, folks? 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered there to rewrite the Constitution of South Carolina so that the state could become one of equality. And among the other things they did there, they passed laws that said that women could divorce abusive husbands. There would be state hospitals and mental institutions. No one would go to jail for debt. And on January the 23rd, 1868, the great Robert Smalls, shown here, got up during that convention and said, resolved, all children in South Carolina between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school for at least 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the first public school law passed this far south below the Mason-Dixon line, right here in South Carolina. Amazing, right? Oh, and it gets even better. This led to the fact that between 1873 and 1877, my alma mater, the University of South Carolina in Columbia, became the first and only desegregated school this far below the Mason-Dixon line, and the only one like that in the 1800s. They had a black professor there named Professor Richard Theodore Greener. He was the first black man to graduate from Harvard. And today, there's a statue of him next to the University of South Carolina's Thomas Cooper Library. That's amazing stuff, isn't it? And some of you would ask, wait a minute, hold it, whoa, 2 things. Why haven't I heard any of this before? Question number 1. And question number 2 is, what happened? I'll answer them both. You see, during the days of slavery and all of that, you had the wealthy class of white people and the poor whites and African Americans. And one of the things that the wealthy whites feared was that these poor whites would find, they had kind of a lot in common with these black people. They were both oppressed. They were both impoverished. They were both kept in illiteracy. You know what? These folks might come together and overthrow our rule. We can't have that happen. So to prevent that, they encouraged the poor whites to separate themselves from the blacks and to look down upon them. In simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. And that's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown. So on December the 24th, 1865, 6 Confederate veterans gathered at the courthouse in Pulaski, Tennessee, to form the Resistance Army Against Reconstruction. And they named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. You kind of see where that led, right? Yeah. So the South then tumbled into turmoil. Memphis Massacre of 1866, New Orleans Massacre of 1866, Meridian, Mississippi Massacre of 1871, Colfax, Louisiana Massacre of 1874, Clinton, Mississippi Massacre of 1875, Hamburg Massacre of 1876, and November the 8th, 1876, blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of Broad Street. Federal government said, man, look, we can't deal with this. This is too much. They're raising too much cane down there. They won't obey our laws. They wouldn't do right if their last name was right. So they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise, February 26, 1877, ended Reconstruction in the South. And so that is what led to the downfall of all of us. And that leads us to an interesting episode in American history that was buried until I wrote my most recent book, which is this. You see, during the time when they had that 1868 Constitutional Convention, there was a guy named Francis Cardozo. Any of y'all heard of the Avery Institute downtown Charleston?
Yes.
Guess what? He was the founding principal of the Avery Institute. He was the son of a Jewish slave owner and a free black woman in downtown Charleston. And so he said at that 1868 convention, listen, we've got people wanting to overturn this Constitution any day now. So we got to make this thing rock-ribbed sure that it's ironclad so that no one in the future can overturn the laws that we make today. How's that for prophecy? This is the kind of guy you want with you when you play the lottery, all right? Because he prophesied that to the ultimate. Because here's what happened. One of the leaders of the Hamburg Massacre that I was telling you about earlier was a guy up in Trenton, South Carolina, Edgefield County. Name was Benjamin Bryan Tillman. Any of y'all heard of him? Pitchfork Ben. Yep, that's right. Well, Pitchfork Ben, let's just say he was not particularly fond of me and my ancestors, to put it mildly. And he claimed to represent the farmers of South Carolina, but he was really trying to build a power base. And by doing that, he played upon the resentment of the poor whites of South Carolina. And a lot of them were resenting the fact that these African Americans were voting and going to school and things like that. So in 1895, he came up with this idea that once he was in the Senate, they would overthrow that progressive Constitution of 1868 and replace it with one that made segregation the laws of the state. So the black community got wind of this, and the great Robert Smalls got together with William J. Whipper, who was a black lawyer who practiced on Broad Street, 2 African-American lawyers from Beaufort, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, Thomas Miller. Y'all heard of South Carolina State University up in Orangeburg? Yeah, the state's major black college. Thomas Miller was the founding president of that. And there was a black teacher from Georgetown named Robert Anderson. These 6 men got together and went to Columbia to try to stop these plans. And what did they do? They gave great, eloquent speeches against this type of thing. They warned the state of South Carolina that by suppressing more than half of its population, that the state could never get progress. And that what Benjamin Tillman and his men were doing would divide the state and ruin its future for years to come. And they spoke with such eloquence that the State House was filled with people night after night after night to hear these great words, and soon it made the papers, and people from all over the world wrote letters in support of the African Americans. Now, any of y'all heard of Booker T. Washington? Okay, he was a great African-American teacher at Tuskegee University down in Alabama. Well, he got into the fray. He wrote an open letter to Benjamin Tillman, and he warned Benjamin Tillman that if you pass this Constitution, what industry would come to a state where half the people are kept in poverty and illiteracy, and that nothing can result out of this but crime and ignorance? And he warned that we have to remember the words of the book of Galatians: what you sow, you shall reap, and that this would ruin the progress of South Carolina for years to come. The history shows that he didn't lie with this. But in spite of the great letters that poured in from around the world in support of these great men in the speech they were giving, Tillman had the support of the vast majority of white South Carolinians. And these men lost in the State House 116-7. But two white delegates, John Harleston Reed of Georgetown and T.E. Dudley of Marlborough County, they voted with the African Americans. Why? Because T.E. Dudley said that doing this would violate the 15th Amendment to the Constitution and would bring the wrath of the federal government down on the state of South Carolina. Well, unfortunately, the federal government looked the other way when all this happened. And the great Robert Smalls, when it came time to sign that new Constitution, he refused and said that he would walk home to Beaufort before he signed that rag of a new Constitution. And the black delegates were celebrated by the black community in Columbia in spite of their loss. And that is what led the state of South Carolina towards segregation. And ironically, the white delegates, when the convention ended, they all held hands and began to sing, "God be with you until we meet again." Oh, the irony. Because that led to the state of affairs that South Carolina would be in for the next 70 years. But the bravery of those great men inspired what would be the civil rights movement in South Carolina that was to come, and we could all agree that those type of changes made the state better. Now wait, I told you that the story was buried until I managed to put it in this book. Well, how did I unbury it? Very simple. One year I was reading a book called African American Oratory from 1797 to 1901. Yeah, I read things like that. And I came across the speech that Thomas Miller made in rebuttal to Benjamin Tillman, where he said, "Call us aliens. If you call us aliens, we who have helped drain the swamps to make this state into what it is today, we who have fought in all this nation wars to make it the arsenal of freedom around the world, if we, Senator Tillman, are aliens, then to whom can the term citizens be applied?" It's like, whoa! You don't find oratory like this anymore. Well, I've never heard about this. And so I went to the archives, looking through the old Columbia State newspapers and the Charleston News and Couriers, and I found this amazing story in which these men went to Columbia to try to stop them from segregating the state, and the amazing impression that they made. But like most stories of its kind, it was buried in the newspapers of yesterday, not to be revived again until I went there and I put all these columns together and wrote this particular book about it and their present influence. And I think it's great because, you see, the thing is, you know, one of the things about history is that is something that we don't want to repeat. And I think if you make things like this public, it makes it somewhat less likely that it's repeated. And the oratory and bravery of these men is such an American story, right up there with Bunker Hill and the Boston Tea Party, that almost every time I tell it to young people, they get inspired to do something constructive. And I think that that's one of the benefits of a story like this. And it also goes to prove a point that I often make when I speak to people, which is this: the more you learn, the more you learn there is to learn. Thank you. told you all of that, do you have any questions? Yes, sir.
From what I read in the Post and Courier, your views would not be well accepted at the Citadel.
Okay, first of all, for those who didn't hear the question, he said that from what he reads in the Post and Courier, my views would not be accepted at the Citadel. Well, actually, sir, I've been there for quite some time, and they know what I do. And see, really, there's really no reason for them not to accept this, because all of this is documented history. And as a history teacher, I put out documented history. So it's not a case of me expressing an editorial point of view. It's basically a matter of me teaching what is documented history, which is what people like me do. So I had encountered very little, if any, real resistance to any of this stuff, to be honest with you. Yes, sir?
I'm asking this one out of ignorance.
Let's hear it.
We read about CRT, critical race theory. So is there any movement in South Carolina to suppress that? What is your comment about that?
First of all, what I just gave you, okay, you asked me about CRT, critical race theory. What I just told you is not critical race theory. Let me make that clear from the outset, okay?
But
the
governor of Florida would disagree with you.
Well, that's the governor of Florida. But I've done, I can't say what Ron DeSantis has read or what he hasn't read, but let me say this about CRT, okay? CRT, in its actual definition, is the study of how race plays a role in the establishment of the law on the law school level, okay? What I do is basic history that is put in layman's terms. That is not critical race theory, okay? Because when you deal with critical race theory, you deal with all these legal maneuvers and that sort of thing, and that's not what I do. Now, what is often falsely labeled as CRT consists of teaching radical, way out stuff on how to hate white people and hate America and, quote, groom children and all that. I don't teach that. I just basically give people facts and let the chips fall where they may. What I have just given you is not necessarily with any sort of agenda, and definitely not to make people hate America or hate white people or groom children or any of that sort of stuff. That's not what I do. I hope that helps.
We're on your side.
Well, that's nice to know, but that you're on my side. But again, it's really not about being on side. It's just that, I just want to I think that these are, I think that these are interesting stories that would be beneficial and inspiring to people. And if you would call that an agenda, then that's probably the only agenda that I would have. I love stories. I love to tell them. And if people can get something constructive out of them, so be it. And that's where my purpose in all of this ends. Hope that helps. Yes, ma'am.
So where do people get this idea about what critical race theory is? And do you know anybody who is actually teaching what they're talking about?
People, okay. Now, first of all, again, real critical race theory is taught at Ivy League universities such as Harvard and places like that. Nobody I know is teaching that kind of stuff on the elementary or high school level that I can personally think of. But then again, I'm not in the elementary or high school level. So, but I do know that nothing like that is taught as far as the South Carolina curriculum goes. And while I don't teach on that level, I associate with a lot of people who do. And a lot of that, I'm just going to be very blunt with you on that, ma'am. A lot of that is basically political rhetoric to play on the emotions and get people in the voting booth. That's the bottom line.
So why don't we hear that defined in the...
I'm glad you asked me that. Now you asked me, why don't you don't hear it properly defined as such? the sad truth is that in a lot of academia, people who know and understand this stuff, a lot of them have difficulty translating these things onto layman's terms that the average person understands. A lot of them know how to speak to the academy and other academians, but they're not very good at doing what I do, which is going out to the general public, because I'm talking to you right now, and you don't have to run to a dictionary for every word I say, right? Everything I'm saying is pretty clear, right? Exactly. So a lot of them have difficulty with that, and a lot of them have this sort of reluctance to get into the public sphere and deal with this kind of thing. That's just not their strong point. So that's why a lot of them don't do that, unfortunately. So I kind of pride myself on being sort of an organic people's intellectual, to where I get in front of people and put this stuff out in layman's terms. I hope that helped. Did it help?
I just don't understand why there are not people who understand it as you do, talking about it on the public stage.
Well, again, as I said before, except for people like, say, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who brings physics down to the people's level, and Dr. Henry Louis Gates, who brings history down to the people's level, who incidentally is a friend and mentor of mine, and Bill Nye, who brings science down to the people's level. A lot of them in those high spheres, that's just not their strong point, which is unfortunate. And this is where I'd like to think that I help take up the slack, people like myself and Dr. Gates and folks like that, and Walter Edgar, who's on National Public Radio down here and all that. That's the kind of thing that we do, you see. You're welcome. Glad that was of help to you. Anything else? Anything else? Okay. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. So incidentally, if you're interested in the books, I'm going to be right here while my dear friend and assistant Abby Stahl here helps out with that. So if you'll join me, I'll be happy to sign books and answer any further questions. It's a pleasure speaking with you. My name is Damon Fordham, and I hope you have a great day, even though it happens to be Monday.
Thanks so much.
Books can be charged to your room.
This was wonderful.
You're very welcome. Hold on, let me turn this off here.